Everyone in that dining room learned to look down when she entered. A single glance from Victoria Ashford could still the loudest conversation and reduce a confident man to a stammering mess. For a decade, she moved through London's finest rooms like a storm, beautiful, cold, and utterly dangerous. People called her many things, cruel, elegant, untouchable. But the truth was simpler and darker. She had made fear into an art form. She did it not from necessity, but for pleasure. Little humiliations became her pastime. A wrongly folded napkin, a mispronounced word, a waiter's sleeve that grazed the edge of her plate. Each offense was a performance, an opportunity to remind everyone who was in charge. Staff lost jobs, reputations were ruined, and promising careers were quietly choked off. No one stood up to her. No one dared, except one woman. Before I tell you what she did, do one small thing. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Write your country and the current time below. Now stay with me, because this is a story of how a broke waitress with a researcher's mind pulled one name out of the past and used it like a scalpel. She didn't need money. She didn't need power. She had one weapon that the richest people feared more than wealth: the truth. From the outside, the place where this all happened looked like a painting of luxury. Crystal chandeliers, linens that smelled faintly of starch and lemon, silverware that sang when it touched porcelain. The Golden Rose had a reputation for being the sort of restaurant where a single bill could buy a month of rent for many of its servers. It was a stage where people came to be seen, and where those with status tested everyone around them to make sure the show held together. Victoria Ashford arrived every Friday at 8. Always the same corner table. Always immaculate. Always smiling in that way that made people uncomfortable. A smile that measured the room and found fault. She came with her husband, Lawrence, tall, reserved, a walking emblem of his own success. He built empires of glass and code. She built something less visible but more destructive, an aura of terror that followed her like smoke. On her first night at the Golden Rose, a young waiter named Thomas learned the rule. His sleeve brushed the air near her plate. An accident, but she snapped like a trap. He was fired on the spot, and she watched him remove his uniform in the kitchen with the same satisfied smile she used on invitations. When stories like that moved from ear to ear among the staff, they changed the way people carried themselves. Fear became a uniform of its own. Into this environment came Rachel Bennett. She was 32, practical, and steady. 3 months earlier, she had been a research assistant to one of London's better investigated journalists. An excellent job, the kind that lets you chase evidence and connect odd dots so other people can see patterns. Then budget cuts came, and that world closed. Rachel was suddenly the sort of person who knew how to find things other people missed and had to sell that skill for tips. She accepted a position at the Golden Rose because she needed rent and because she was pragmatic. She learned how to carry a bread basket without looking at it, how to fold napkins so they never gave away the server's hand, how to count covers with the speed of a cashier. But she also listened. Restaurants are like small nations. Staff rooms hold histories. People told stories there because the customers could not hear the truth. Stories about guests, about the nights that tore at the seams of ordinary life. George, a waiter with 15 years' service etched across his face, took Rachel aside one afternoon and pointed to the corner booth. "That's where she sits," he said. "That's where trouble starts." He told her about other men who had left the city because they could not find work after Victoria's word spread. He told her about a man who had been accused of contaminating a meal, though he had never touched anything. She watched all this with a researcher's calm. This was data. Then one Friday, everything became more immediate. Rachel was assigned to table 12. That was blood in the water, a moment where the staff collectively held their breath. She prepared herself like someone about to face a tribunal. Still water, no ice, a single thin slice of lime. Bread with sourdough only. She memorized how Victoria liked her napkins folded and how she hated the lighting. Rachel was careful because carefulness buys time. Time lets you see. Victoria arrived like a storm. Diamonds at her throat. A dress that made her look airless. Her eyes were cold blue, scanning, measuring. Her voice was soft and precise, the kind that cut better than a shout. She began the work of reminding everyone of their place. She sent back a whine, complained that the lighting made her husband look old. Each complaint was a test. A waiter named Daniel got a test. He didn't survive. His sleeve hovered near a plate. Victoria recoiled as if poisoned. "Your sleeve touched my food," she said loudly, and the restaurant went silent. Daniel stood trembling. The manager apologized, offered to replace dishes, but it was theater. Control disguised as hygiene. In the kitchen, people watched Daniel's face pale and the staff's hands tremble because everyone could picture themselves on that stage next. Rachel watched Daniel's humiliation and felt something begin to grow inside her. Not anger in a loud sense, but sharp, disciplined attention. She had been trained to notice the small things that made other people's stories whole. She had watched injustice and cataloged it like evidence. After the shift, she went home with a taste of lemon and bread on her collar, and a list forming in her head. Names, incidents, dates. She was methodical in an emotion-charged place. The weeks that followed were quiet investigations. Rachel listened in the staff room. She pressed for details when people drifted into reminiscence. There were patterns. Victoria always targeted appearances, always tested formality, always used tiny humiliations to remove people's dignity. The stories had the same voice. Someone seemingly fragile, someone mimicking a role, launching into cruelty when any performance risked exposure. Rachel suspected the performance hid the person. Something about Victoria's cruelty felt compensatory. The furious way a person polishes a surface that will be valued only if it never chips. She dug where others had not. Public records turned up the Neat Society announcements about the Ashford engagement and philanthropic work. The story of a woman from polite family in Bath. It should have been ordinary. It was instead discipline constructed for the public. That was only the surface. The first solid break came from an old image on a forgotten site, buried on the 12th page of search results where nobody normally wandered. It was a promotional portfolio from a talent agency in Manchester years earlier. On that page, a photograph of a young woman with over-processed hair and a ferocious jawline stared back under a different name, Vicky Brightwell. She was younger, rougher, loud with an accent not of the polished parlor, but of the working towns. The bone structure, the eyes, familiar. Rachel pulled the thread. Forums remembered a reality show from 2004, Motorway Dreams. It was trashy entertainment about promotional models on a racing circuit, cheap lights and loud arguments. In some grainy clip there was Vicky, agitated, fighting over makeup, screaming, a woman who wanted the world, who practiced accents and mirrors and tried to erase where she came from. The smile she wore now in candlelit restaurants was a costume she had learned to perform. Finding the name was not enough. Rachel needed corroboration. She found a forum member who had grown up with Vicky and, with patient research and a practiced voice, persuaded her to talk. The woman remembered Vicky's hunger to disappear. She remembered the talent agency, the nights of cheap fame, and the final breakdown that left a mark on a small community. The witness, hesitant and sharp, offered pieces, a backstage argument, a ring of cheap tiaras, footage that was never broadcast but privately circulated. Rachel knew the stakes. Naming Vicky Brightwell to a dining room full of people would not be a harmless reveal. It would be a surgical strike. It would expose a manufacturer identity and could obliterate a life built painstakingly over 10 years. She thought about the ethics. She thought about mercy and consequence. In her training as an investigator, she had learned to weigh harm against benefit. Victoria's pattern of harm, firing people, ruining careers, weaponizing small humiliations, was ongoing. Exposure promised to stop further, predictable harm. The next Friday, Victoria came alone and coldly composed. She summoned Rachel. The staff watched as the rules of the room warped. A server sitting with a patron was a breach of every standard. Rachel obeyed because she wanted to see how confident Victoria would be in the face of the truth. Confrontation was a test of nerves, and every investigator knows nerves can crack the most practiced facade. Victoria did what she always did. She tried to erase the person confronting her by naming their weaknesses first. She listed Rachel's losses aloud. Contracts ended debts, the cramped flat. She told her how easy it would be to make her disappear. But that was the wrong move. Threats reveal fear. Rachel answered not with emotion, but with fact. She spoke the name Vicky Brightwell and detailed the evidence she had gathered. Rachel's voice was steady, the cadences of someone who has worked late nights in archives and held fragments of stories together until they formed a pattern. The way Victoria collapsed was not dramatic in a cinematic sense. There were no raised voices or violent scenes, only a small, unmistakable disintegration. The practiced smile unspooling, the careful posture folding inward. For someone whose life depended on costume and image, exposure had more force than any threat of lawsuits. Public performance was her currency. Take that away, and the market crashed. Victoria left without a show. She walked out, and the staff exhaled with the kind of sound that had been missing from the Golden Rose for years. They had not just witnessed a single defeat. They had watched the slow unmasking of a person who had used subtle cruelty as a way to flex power. In the pauses that followed, people checked one another's faces, as if confirming they were still human, still visible. After that night, word spread, not as instant headlines. The papers might have noticed eventually, but as the way things move in small communities, a repetition in staff rooms, a quiet shared story that made people feel safer. Rumors of Victoria's old life shifted from gossip to evidence. Patrons who had once been cowed felt relief. Some said it was justice. Others said it was cruelty. Rachel accepted the discomfort of that moral gray. Sometimes right answers have rough edges. The consequences were real. Victoria retreated from the circuits where she once performed her role. The absence of her visits changed the rhythms of the Golden Rose. Shift that had always been planned around a presence suddenly had a different pulse. Staff found their steps lighter. Daniel and Thomas returned in spirit, if not in situation. Those who had left the city returned to other lives and told their tales to new ears. Not everyone cheered. There were those who felt pity for a woman who had lived in fear of being discovered, and thus had built walls that damaged others. There are always two faces to redemption, one that asks forgiveness and one that demands accountability. Rachel's choice had been to prioritize preventing further harm. She did not relish Victoria's downfall. She chose it because harm needed to be stopped. Life moved on. For Rachel, the night of the reveal closed one chapter and opened another. A private investigator who had watched the encounter offered her a role leading investigations. He recognized skills that intersected with courage, careful observation, patient digging, and the nerve to use discovery when discretion would not suffice. Rachel accepted and returned to the work she loved. Only this time, she was finding truths on behalf of people who needed them, not just to satisfy a story. There's a lesson in the way this story unfolded. Power is often disguised as manners. Cruelty can be delivered with a soft voice and a measured complaint. Institutions and communities enable such behavior when they allow silence to harden into a rule. One person stepping forward to speak a truth can loosen that rule's grip. It does not always have to be dramatic. Sometimes it is a quiet choice. Gather facts, weigh consequences, and then speak. Another lesson is about the complexity of people. Victoria was not simply a villain. She was a person who had erased her past and then tried to crush reminders of it. That does not excuse her. It explains how shame and ambition can mutate into a pattern that hurts others. Understanding motive does not remove responsibility. Recognizing complexity helps us decide how to respond, whether to punish, reform, or protect. If you were in a room where someone used status to wound, what would you do? Would you look away because looking away is safer? Or would you keep a record of what happened and find a time to speak? These questions do not have simple answers, but they are important. Courage looks different in different people. For Rachel, it was research and a steady voice. For someone else, it might be an immediate defense or a public outcry. All of those choices break the same silence. What happened to Lawrence? He called months later with the voice of a man who had spent too long on the wrong side of a private ease. He told Rachel he had known things and had done little. He said he would divorce Victoria. Sometimes the consequences people face are not only professional but personal. The marriage, it seemed, could not survive the strain of truth. Whether that was redemption or merely escape from embarrassment is for others to decide. In the months that followed, conversations in back rooms changed tones. Servers shared tips about resilience. Managers learned that protecting staff was not only ethical but practical. People started to tell their stories sooner, not later. Small acts of resistance accumulated into a culture where extraordinary cruelty was less likely to be tolerated. This is not a neat story of revenge or perfect justice. It is the messy story of one woman who noticed patterns, documented them, and used what she learned to stop further harm. The ending was not about spectacle. It was about removing a predator's stage. In doing so, Rachel preserved the dignity of countless small lives that had been trampled under the weight of polished menace. There was a particular evening Rachel kept replaying in her mind. The phone call with the forum member who helped connect pieces of the past. The woman, Beth, spoke with the bluntness of someone who had been small-town sharp and then faced a city that swallowed names. She remembered Vicky's hunger and her attempts to mimic a better life. She practiced accents in the mirror, Beth said. She sent scans of an old flyer and a shaky photo. Seeing the younger face made it impossible to pretend the past hadn't existed. Watching the raw footage that Beth described was disorienting. It wasn't cinematic. It was cheap television with a shabby crown and cameras that caught too much. A woman argued about a lipstick, then snapped at the humiliation of an ill-fitting tiara. In that frame, Rachel saw both abrasive behavior and a vulnerability that explained, however little, why such cruelty might exist. It didn't excuse anything. If anything, it made the stakes clearer. A decades-long performance that depended on secrecy could be undone by a single uncovered seam. Rachel slept poorly for a week. She weighed legal risks, privacy concerns, and the human cost of exposing someone's past. Her training as a researcher had a scale for harm and benefit. She kept recalibrating it. In the end, she returned to the pattern of injuries. People losing jobs, young servers punished for accidents, futures interrupted. Her choice to speak was not a leap into vindictiveness. It was a decision to stop ongoing harm that had a predictable trajectory. After the confrontation, when a private investigator handed his card across a small table and asked if she would consider working with him, Rachel felt like a closed loop had opened. He was practical. He saw the work, not the spectacle. "We need people who can follow breadcrumbs and treat them like evidence," he said. He offered mentorship and a salary that would change the rhythm of Rachel's life. The job was an invitation to reuse a painful skill set for public good. The fallout was complicated. Some felt sympathy for a woman who had tried so desperately to remake herself. Others called it accountability. Restaurants updated complaint procedures and reassessed how they protected staff. The immediate cruelty that had been normalized in corners of the service industry loosened as conversations moved from private to formal. That kind of institutional shift happens slowly, but it happens because one person undertakes the costly work of gathering facts and handing them to people who can act. Years later, the Golden Rose had not remade the world, but it altered how it held those who worked inside it. Rachel moved from a cramped flat to an office, not because she sought reward, but because her skill was finally matched with opportunity. She still thought sometimes about the woman who had worn many names. If pity came, it came with the recognition that cruelty often hides a battered past. But pity does not erase responsibility. In the end, the story is a quiet argument for truth, not a shout for revenge, but an insistence that harms are accountable. Systems are built of habits, policies, and the decisions of people. When someone decides to locate facts and speak, the balance can change. It does not guarantee perfect justice, but it can protect the many from the recurring cruelty of the few. If you have a story of someone stepping forward or a memory where silence allowed harm, share it now. Write your country and the current time where you're watching. These small acts of speech are the threads from which change is stitched. When we close this chapter, remember, power that depends on humiliation is fragile. It's built on a heap of silence and compliance. When even one person begins to pull the heap apart, the whole pile can collapse. It might not be pretty or simple, but it can be true. Courage sometimes looks like a quiet name spoken in a crowded room. Sometimes it looks like a careful search across old records. But always, it starts with someone deciding they will no longer bow.